No, this is a very vague topic, and in fact, I noticed all of the topics this year are extremely vague, which is a good thing because it gives us a lot of latitude and forces us to define the very question that we are trying to answer, or at least frame the topic in such a way. I mean, architecture of change in and of itself can make reference to so many different things. There's an implication, I think, at least from an emotional level, that the idea of change is good and that architecture is an agent of change for the better. So at least from my perspective, that's where I'm going to be leading the discussion, and I welcome other definitions of that kind of neutral statement, architecture of change. One of the things that we architects and people in the design professions have to struggle with, I think, always is, are we leading the charge? Is whatever momentum, good or bad, something that we are involved in? Is that a direction that we have selected? And is it a momentum that we are supplying the positive energy towards? I'm not 100% sure that is the case. So if you establish certain criteria, if you assume architecture of change means attempts by the architectural community to effect positive change in society, then maybe what we have to do is work backwards a little bit and ask ourselves, has architecture been an agent of positive change in history? Has it been an agent of change in recent human history? Can we anticipate that architecture will be a positive agent of change into the future? I'm an architect. I've been an architect for a long, long time. I established my practice in 1991, which I believe is like well before most of the people in this room were even born. Now, during that time, I've had a chance to think about architecture quite extensively. I will say that I love the practice of architecture, the work that I do, the challenges that I am faced with, more today than I ever have before. And it's a wonderful, wonderful profession from the perspective of, our own unique involvement. The challenges are interesting. The people with whom we interact are often fascinating. The entire ecosystem of issues and problems and contradictions are just endlessly engaging. And then as we mature, we become more confident in our ability to piece together the puzzle of architecture. Having said that, I wonder if we oversell our ability to impact society in a positive way, and whether or not we are in fact agents of dysfunction and non-positive change as much as we are agents of positive change. So one of the questions I think we architects and citizens of this and any other society have to ask ourselves are, what are the most important issues that a society needs to solve? And once we've established that list, to what extent can architecture solve? So let's say in the Philippine context, you can choose a few out of the air: poverty, corruption, transportation, infrastructure, whatever, you can choose. Then you can ask yourself the question, if that is the criteria, let's say poverty, it's one of the biggest. Now, if a poor person walks into my building and he walks out of the building, he's likely going to be just as poor on both sides. If a corrupt politician walks into my building and then walks back out, he'll be just as corrupt. So, to what extent, I'm curious, can we architects suggest that we are in fact capable of effecting positive change at some fundamental level? AJ, I'll start with you.
The the primary ethos of. But before I need to tell you that we had a little conversation via email when Toby, an Anthology convened us through the email, and Toby gave us some provocative statements to work on by stating that indeed architecture may not be an agent of positive change. And with his citation of the projects of Le Corbusier in the habitat. Anyway, to answer that question and using that as a reference, I would completely agree with the opening declaration of Toby that that part is a little questionable, that a corrupt person coming in will still be the same corrupt person coming out. Poverty, corruption, efficiency, cultural issues. I used to teach at the Benilde Architecture School, and we always teach our students that you need to be careful about embracing or going into the delusion that architecture has the answer, or design has the answer to the problems of the universe, because it does not. And again, you will be deluding yourself. I mean, yeah, fine, it's just your thesis, but you bring that together in the industry. So what we did, my position basically is, since I know that I'm an activist, I'm from the UP, and I do want change. So I went on and decided to go into what is manageable for me as a designer. I do believe that design can affect change, whether that's good or bad. It will affect change to a certain degree. But whether it will eliminate poverty, I doubt it. But could it make the poor people happier on a day-to-day basis? It could be. So that's where I came into, and that's where I anchored the ethos of the design firm, the organization that I manage, and together with the design school that we founded in Benilde, that by behavioral change, by affecting design strategies or system solutions, we can affect minute or even moderately sized behavioral changes with the users. So in essence, without drama, the commercial statement is we change society person by one person at a time, or one family at a time, or one organization at a time. So that's where I set my limit. I do not ambition to go into a delusion of changing politics or society with a monument.
So Rika, AJ actually just made, I think, a revolutionary declaration that I think pretty much, invalidates or challenges very directly everything that, say, we learned, especially in architecture school. That architecture is a noble profession, that it's at the vanguard of great movements and great things in culture, that we have the power and the capability and the capacity to lead society in a particular direction. Do you agree with this, depressingly negative characterization of architecture?
I think there's always two perspectives on any issue. First and foremost, we each of us, we spend 90% of our lives in buildings. From the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed, we're in buildings, whether it's at work, it's at school. So the buildings that we create really have the power to influence us. But to say that architects alone have the power to enact so much change is, I think, extremely wrong. Oftentimes we could become so self-absorbed in what we're doing, and we think, okay, we're so amazing, we can do all these things. But the reality of it is, architecture is extremely, it's dependent on a lot of other things. Good architecture is a product of a lot of people coming together, the client, the contractor. Oftentimes we don't even have the financial or political muscle to be able to create good buildings. So I think going into education, we need to realize that there are so many more people involved in creating good architecture. But I don't want to keep talking about good things. I mean, yes, it's fantastic that architecture can enable and ennoble, but I think just talking about that, we close the doors on other issues, on other societal issues, like the fact that architecture sometimes will not has more detrimental effects to society. There's a building in Paris, I can't remember which one, but it's in France, and it's become a breathing ground for a lot of crime. A lot of gangs, I believe. Okay, this is getting too negative, but like a lot of gangs.
It's
I just wanted to be a bit more controversial. A lot of gangs gather in that building. A lot of rape happens in that building. A lot of crime in general, drugs. And so the government at one point was thinking, should we just tear this down? What do we do about this? But in the end, they actually kept it and just tried to see what other programs they could. I think also maybe in part due to the fact that there was some sense of fear from the government, like to knock this building down. But so it's not all good, but that's why we have events like this to come together and see how we can do a more.
Sure. That's an interesting observation that within architecture, behavior happens. Sometimes that behavior is of the sort that we architects had envisioned and hoped that the architecture would stimulate, and in other cases, that's not the case. So you're making reference, actually, and I think so did AJ, when he talked about Corbusier, about the generation of the early modernists. So I think many of them came out, they were young men and women who came of age during World War I. Now, World War I was, the first industrialized war, really, where millions of people were killed, essentially for no good reason. It brutalized the European continent, and it also stimulated the creative groups, especially architects, to imagine a better future. And they thought, well, I wonder if a new city, a new paradigm of architecture, of urbanism, would allow us to, to enact a better society. Now, Corbusier, I think, was emblematic of that idea. When in hindsight, he was being a very antiseptic Swiss person, and as a Swiss person myself, I can kind of relate. But he kind of thought that if we clean away the cobwebs of history, literally, get rid of those beautiful winding streets in the Marais, replace everything with in big shiny buildings that were prefabricated maybe in a factory, that the orderliness and the cleanliness and the predictability and the objectivity and the equality between spaces and buildings would translate into similar qualities of culture. And there are many, many kind of sub movements, like what was it called, the guys who thought every generation should knock down the buildings of the generation before so they can create the Italian futurists, I think. But anyway, cultural critics kind of marked the beginning of that idea of modernism as an effective agent of change. Soon after the World War I ended, even though the aesthetic ideas had been developing for a while. And they kind of marked the official end of it, I think, in 1973 when they blew up Pruitt-Igoe. Pruitt-Igoe was a vast housing complex that suffered many of the same social ills that you just described. It happened to have been in the United States. And that moment in time, I forget, it's like July 3rd, 3 p.m., it's 1973 or 1978, they blew it up and the buildings fell down, and that is kind of, in the canon of the critics, that's kind of marked as the official end of modernism. And in my mind, maybe it also marks the official end of optimism as for architecture as an agent of change. So Peach, on that depressing note, please argue against, these preceding, cesspools of negativity by, yes.
With a follow-up question
Yes,
also
ma'am.
for Peach.
Okay.
Because she's doing amazing things in Marawi.
Okay.
So maybe she can also draw parallels into the work that she's doing in Marawi with your question. I think that'd be very, very
Okay.
interesting, because who else would be doing work in Marawi?
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I think, as Toby said, most of our audience are students, or I can see very, very young architects. So I'm sure you haven't experienced having a big design commission yet. And so I would like to take it back a little bit and make it simpler so that our audience can relate to, the things that we are saying. My reaction first to our discussion, I think, first of all, architecture, the way we are talking about it, it seems like we are talking about it as a subject, as a group. But every architect, every design is different for everybody. Rebecca and I can design the same building with two different solutions, two totally different designs for our project. So I think basic, if we have to go basic, of course, change is always happening, and we can affect change as a person and as an architect. So first, we have to understand what architecture is and how we want to affect change on the designs that we do. So collectively, later on, if more architects develop a mindset or a heart set to effect good change, then maybe, we can say that in this era, architecture was for good change. But we cannot do absolute assumptions where, there are buildings that were used for drugs but I'm sure it's because someone started to do drugs and it was profitable and it became a habit, to use it. And so it was repurposed for a bad thing. But I'm sure that when it was designed initially, it wasn't for that bad purpose, but for a good purpose. Did the architect of that building fail his commission by making it adaptable to bad use? That's something that's individually, I think we need to, as architects, that we need to really internalize, as young as you are now, to understand how much you can affect change. It can be as simple as when you design a house for the homeless. You change their lives by giving them dignity. If you design it without a heart, then you're designing a doghouse. But if you design it with the intention that you are providing a home for these people, it probably will give them enough hope and inspiration and encouragement to do better in life. That's how you have affected change through architecture. I think we need to talk about it more on the student mindset rather than, the big project absolute theories of architecture, so that they can understand it, put it to heart, and put it to practice when it's time for them to be the architects of the future.
You're absolutely right. And it's certainly not all negative out there. And I think the conversation will take a sharp turn in a minute. So Adrian is not an architect, but he works with systems that tie architecture together. You're infrastructure, essentially, engineers, so he worries about how we can all have water when we turn on our taps, that the sewage drains appropriately to where it has to go, and other types of networks that are bigger than any individual piece of architecture, and that kind of create the web, parts of that web within which our individual projects exist. And so, that makes me remember that architecture is really more than the sum of its parts, and that the individual work that we do is a little bit less significant than the entire accretion, especially within cities, that we contribute to. So I'm wondering, Adrian, if you talk about your perspective, maybe in a way you haven't thought about it before, but the work that you do and how it makes possible the work that we do.
It's something we do think about a lot, and I think more so now than we ever did before. I certainly felt in the last 4 or 5 years a real change in how myself as an engineer, I have to interact with architects and other people who deal with the built environment. Because I think what we're realising is it's really not just one individual. As you say, it's a system of interconnected parts, and you need to understand all of those parts to deliver something that's more positive. To go back to your original question, does architecture change how things work? Well, one thing that always comes to mind is people say in the Philippines we have a lot of corruption. Yes, we do. But actually, we do have corruption in other countries. It's just hidden in different ways. I'm originally from the UK, and we used to deal with a lot of planning authorities, so effectively city engineers. And they would ask for certain things to be done. When we did a development, they would say, could you build us a road here, or could you put a school in there? It doesn't sound like the same thing, but actually it is the same. They're trying to manipulate something, often not what they put in their original plan or what they put in their original concept for that city, that area, that building, and they try and direct you to do something that you didn't originally plan or want to do. So I guess you have to be ready to push back a little bit and say, is that the right decision? Why is it the right decision if it is the right decision, or why is it not the right decision if you don't feel that is the right way to go with something? And I think it's having the confidence, and you don't get that straight away, you get it over time, but even on a small scale, you can say, hang on, that wasn't what I was asked to do, that doesn't work in the context of what I'm trying to achieve here and what I think the bigger picture is. And you push back and you ask the question and you say, hang on, can we make a change? Can we do something a bit different? And it's at that level there's a positive change, because you've changed the outcome or the overall concept of what you thought you were going to get.
Thank you. So, AJ, would you then, I think I saw you nodding when I suggested that we are part of a larger matrix. Would you say that we then have to reframe the question if we want to think about change, positive change, affected through the manifestation of the built environment somehow? Really have to broaden the question. So it's agents of change that include this very, very long list of components of society that are involved in there, from politics of change, the infrastructure, the water infrastructure of change, the sewage infrastructure of change, the zoning infrastructure of change, and so on and so forth, to make the question more meaningful and to remind us that the work that we do independently is less significant, or not even possible, if we ignore that larger infrastructure.
Yes, that's why I'm in the answers that followed my remark a while ago. And to respond to that, yeah, we need to reframe it into a larger perspective, or yeah, in a manner that I may take the topic back to the project of Le Corbusier in Paris, where when I made some readings back then on that project, the reason why drugs, I forget that there's the word habitat in the project. It's the same
The
condominium.
Ban Louise,
I think so.
well, which just refers to, I think, the suburbs,
the housing project.
the,
Yeah.
the new social house,
Yes, we're talking about the same
social
building.
housing projects
Yes,
in the
on
suburbs.
Pilates.
And yeah. Oh well, Corbu's is it the Corbu's project?
Yes, yes.
No, it's not. Habitation was in Marseille.
Oh, there,
The
I was referring to that.
Cité that's Habitation. That's Marseille. But anyway,
Marseille.
yeah.
Yeah.
It kind of failed with respect to his original intention.
That's right. From
But
the
I don't-
readings that I made,
Yeah.
the reason why it failed was because the Corbusian model of the good life was that particular order. That you created condominiums, floors and floors of.
And turned your back on the life of the street. In
That's
fact, the
right.
shopping street was at the 12th floor or something like
That's
that.
right. And in effect, it created this corridor of siloed communities where the gangs took over, and each floor would have a gang that.
Kind of the antithesis of the Jane Jacobs model.
Yes, that's right. So my point is, architecture in that model held on to its ego as a very deterministic instrument of change. It essentially said, we know what's good for you, and this is the environment manifest in this building on what is good.
And sorry, and also I think it implied that architecture alone.
Yes, architecture
independently-
alone. Yeah, so my point being is architecture needs to understand that it needs to release this ego of being the prime source of solutions and to devolve itself from this elevation and put it together within the ranks of the other solution providers, like, yes, the government, civil society, science, engineering, culture. And until it does that, until it embraces completely without ego this bottom to top approach, then it cannot, I think, it cannot hope to affect even the most humble intentions of change. Even on the effort of designing a residence, modernism unfortunately came from that model. Yeah, it's we know what's good for you, therefore this is how it should look like. Postmodernism, I think, went on as an antithesis to that, but not completely. So the larger perspective is, how can architecture frame itself properly without this ego in a bottom-to-top approach, gathering everyone so that it can orchestrate these various agents to fulfill this intention of change. Then I think if that happens, if that ever happens at all, then those social, political, cultural ambitions of change that we were hankering for as an ambitious individual would happen. But until that, I don't think it will happen.
So Rika, I think the model of architecture that AJ is arguing for is maybe analogous to that of Hollywood or movie making, where there is no one person. Even though some people get top billing, the director may get top billing, or the handsome actor or the beautiful actress get top billing. They really don't deserve it. It's really an integrated, collaborative art form, technical form, entertainment form. It's many, many different things that rely on many people, all of whose contributions are equal in order to ensure the culmination of a successful product. So can you see architecture framed in the same way, both theoretically and also in the context of your own work as an architect? What is he asking? I guess simplified is, do we architects work alone, or do we work in a big, big team?
No, we always work. As I mentioned earlier, good architecture is a product of a lot of people coming together because architects are not the only users of the buildings that we create. So are other people. But we're here talking about all these massive projects, and as Peach mentioned earlier, the reality of it is it's very hard to get a big project, and these projects are far and a few. Like, okay, let's say for instance a lot of the project, the very obvious projects that are drivers for social change are the institutional buildings. And again, going back to the Philippines and the reality of life is these are far and few. Like there's been the Supreme Court design competition, there's a design for Senate that's taken place at least in the time that I've been back over the last 5 years. So they're far and few and they haven't even been built. So going back to what Peach said, we shouldn't just think of architecture as these monumental monstrosities, even sometimes, that enable and enact change. They do. And I think one example, I think that, again, sorry, I'm using more first world examples because, okay, no, well, we can use the CCP. That's a bit more digestible for the audience. The CCP in front of it has that really nice plaza. And there is a lack of public plazas in our country. So Leandro Luxin's scheme, he was able to create that space to encourage public life, engagement, and community life. But these don't have to happen only in massive buildings. I think one of the projects that I can think of right now that most people might know here are the book stop by WTA, which it's literally a 12 square meter box that didn't take more than 300,000 pesos to build, and it was something that he built out of his own veracity to create architecture in a small form to enable change. So the whole idea behind it was, we could use books and we could use that. We could make the monstrosities of libraries smaller, break them down into small pieces that are more digestible to people. So it's not only big projects that enact change, but even small ones. And I think that's very important to remember. Because, again, like I said, the reality of it is you might not get a big project that will enable wider change.
Thank you very much. I just want to turn the conversation for 1 minute to the young architects and aspiring architects in the room, because I think I've heard something shocking, maybe that I've never heard before in my life. I've heard AJ, Rika, and Peach, and also Adrian suggest that we don't have all the answers, that we shouldn't be so egotistical, that we shouldn't assume that we can change or save the world. Has anybody confronted that reality yet among the young architects? And I think at this point I do need a response. Young lady, can you please stand up and talk to me about that? Are you an architecture student? You can both stand up. No? Give this young lady a microphone. Has AJ essentially just crushed your entire conception of what architecture is?
Not entirely, because of course I agree that architecture doesn't have all the answers. We aspiring architects or architects doesn't have the total capability of being like saviors of everyone. Of course, we need each other. We need our unique capabilities to build something or create something that would impart hope, spark hope, bring this change into people that even those who aren't really so big in life would do more and give a part of themselves, even in the most simplest of ways.
That's very eloquently put. In other words, I think you're saying that small victories are
Yes,
enough
small
sometimes.
victories are enough and they matter as well.
It's very nicely put. Peach, I think you better hire this young lady. And I think that's the argument that you were making effectively as well.
If I could just make a comment on about the ego, what AJ was talking about, and how architects should go down and, you know, be on the same level as everyone. I think a good architect knows this, knows that everybody has an important role in making a successful project. You cannot do it by yourself. But everybody, in saying that everybody has a role, someone has to take the lead. Not necessarily an architect, because the way times are changing right now, project managers are hired before the architect. So, but still, the one that sets the direction on the design, on the architectural design, where everything stems from, I think, the architect's role then is to make sure that the design that he or she had done is built the way that you know, that it's going to have a positive impact and change on the people that will use it, on the environment and the community.
Nicely put. Adrian, you know, I in my practice, sometimes I'll get a call from somebody and they're very shy and hesitant, and you know, they tell me they have a very small project and I'm probably not interested, and then they're about ready to hang up usually before I even speak with them. And then it may in fact be very, very modest, even at the level of scale that I will end up losing money if I engage it. But I have a practice of never turning people away, because my sense is that architecture is a service to individuals and to society in the same way that, you know, medicine and a doctor is obligated and should feel obligated, and a teacher should feel obligated to execute their capacity to help, and so on across the board. So I'm wondering if we look at the work that we do really as a service, that it is that we are mandated by virtue of the fact that we not only chose this path, but that the state has privileged us actually by giving us a license to do something that other people cannot do. We are privileged in a way by a monopoly of knowledge that other people generated and passed on to us, and that we are a protected class in a way. But even more so than that should be the fundamental motivation, is to serve. I wonder if that's maybe the kind of momentum that will allow us, architects, engineers, all of the people involved in forging society, using our special skills on behalf of the larger politic to imagine futures that define positive change.
Yeah, I don't think it's always to serve. There's obviously some realities to what you can and can't do. But if someone comes, I mean, yeah, I'm probably fortunate to be working generally on slightly larger scale projects. Typically, that tends to be where we sit in the world and the projects that I've always worked on. So yeah, we do not do some projects, but there's always a way, if there's a project that really will deliver a positive benefit, to make that project happen. You don't have to do it all yourself. You can engage with other people in the community who can fill in some of the gaps if we can't do it all. And internally, I mean, for those that know Arup as a firm, we have ways of finding, and I think most big firms do, ways of doing that work on a freelance or a pro bono basis if we need to. And I think most professionals have a way of doing that if they think there's something we can do. Just going back to the point that was made before about how everything's interrelated. We used to use a term called total architecture for designing buildings. We now use the word total design because we've realised that it isn't just architecture that goes in, it's the mechanical system, the electrical system, everything else you need to put that whole thing together. And it takes a real skill to have the right people in charge. It doesn't have to be an architect, it doesn't have to be an engineer, it could be an ecologist or someone who is the right person to lead a project if they've got the right capabilities or skill set. And in the context of, say, some of the less developed places where we'll work, and I think more so as we're developing communities which don't have a huge infrastructure or a huge built environment, it will be sort of people who know the local community who are the best people to direct a project. And it's our skill as professionals to work with those people, to bring to them what they need, to help guide them, but not to overrule them or not to step on them, so that they can tell us what they need and we can work best with them to do the most effective job, whatever that effective job is. It doesn't have to be big and shiny. It can be very, very simple, like you were saying, something that they can actually work with and delivers a benefit.
Sure. It's well put. I want to throw another question out to our young architects before we segue into a slightly other topic. I'm kind of curious, as to the motivations that brought you to make the decision to study architecture, and whether as you engage in the study of architecture through the years, as you move up through the rank and you're exposed to more experiences in the design studio, more opinions that you have been exposed to through reading, through critical dialogue and so on, whether your perspective on your eventual role as a designer, as a member of a professional class, as a member of that cadre of civilization that is called upon to make positive changes, if that has evolved over time. So maybe give me your hand. Who's a third, fourth, and fifth year students in architecture? If you don't raise your hand, I will just find you anyway. We have one. Yes, young man. So tell me a little bit about how your view of your eventual role as an architect has changed from the moment that you entered school to this present moment that you find yourself in.
Okay. Hi, I'm Joseph. I'm from UST. So when I entered architecture, one of my first, the architect that inspired me to go into architecture was Lloyd Wright. And then I remember that the story that really made me want to take up architecture was that, I don't know if it's real, the story of how he conceptualized the falling water, how he made it in 2 hours, cramming it. That kind of inspired me. If you can do if that's possible to make something great like that, you can probably create great things by pursuing this field. But I'm in my second to the last year from graduating, and I read a lot of books, and there's this one book that really influenced the way I see architecture as a profession. I'm not sure if you've heard of Jeremy Till. He's from the UK. He wrote a book on Architecture Depends. He deconstructed the architectural profession in the modern age, how before people would see the architect as someone who holds, he deals with a lot of high profile clients. But now if you look at it in today's perspective, and especially with millennials today, you'll notice that we're more attuned to the social problems. That's the reason why we have things like participatory design, there's more discourse on things like bottom-up design. So there's more of a collaborative approach, more into the process of how a design is created and not from that idealistic, from this one person comes this amazing building, and all of the efforts of whoever's involved is.
So in other words, you're suggesting you transition from admiring the lone, heroic Frank Lloyd Wright to the idea of design as a more democratic and therefore more effective model for social development.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I'm gonna answer your
Yes,
question.
yes, ma'am.
Oh, sorry. Did I cut that?
Yes.
I did?
No, go ahead.
Oh, right.
Sorry.
Okay. I'm going to answer your question as to why I decided to become an architect or why to study architecture. So I'm sure all of you have gone through this experience when you're in high school. You have to choose your course, and you have to. You just can't not. And so, in part, I didn't really know what I wanted to be back then. So I come from a family of, I'm not very proud, but a family of politicians, a family people in real estate, no architect in my family. But it was, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, so I took a gap year. And I went around, I was campaigning on a national election. So I was going around to every city, and at that time I was like, okay, I'm gonna be a lawyer, I'm gonna study law, and I'm gonna be the president of the Philippines one day, someday. But then actually, toward the end of the election, I was like, oh my God. It was the first opportunity I had to go all over the country. I was literally waking up in a new city every day. And so I was like, wait a minute. Actually, a lot of politicians don't do that much to be able to change. And I even looked at my family and I'm like, what have you guys done? But just kidding. Then it was there I realized that being an architect, you could do so much more. You could actually concretize what you wanted to achieve and what you wanted to be able to make. So and then after that, I was like, okay, after the election, 2010 national election, I was like, fuck that, I'm gonna go be an architect. So I then studied architecture. And when I was in architecture, I still had that inclination of wanting to change the world somehow, one way or another. So one of the typologies that I became so obsessed with was markets. I had the chance and the opportunity to live in the UK, and I was in the market. I started to do my own palenque. I had to do everything for myself, right? So I would, and I didn't want to spend so much because it's kuripot, so I was abroad, everything's expensive. So I would actually go to the market every day because I didn't want to spend on refrigeration. So every day I would go to the market. It was part of my daily life. And then when I moved back home, I see all these palenques. Like, how many of you actually enjoy going to the palenque? Not to buy food, but, the whole experience of it. No one. No one's raised their hands. Oh, you do? It's mabaho, it's dirty, it's dingy. You enjoy it?
First place I go to, any city that I
Oh
visit.
my gosh.
Not
No,
only here.
No, yeah, okay, whatever. But here in the Philippines, it was so different. So I couldn't wrap my head around it. And if you talk to some of the vendors, a lot of them don't really own their stalls and they're just consigning from other people. So I became obsessed with that. And you were asking me earlier, how do I manifest change into the projects that we do? I didn't answer it. I sidetracked. But I became so obsessed with markets. And then this one client that I had for a hotel was just asking about my ideologies and thoughts about architecture. And I told him, one day I'm going to make a beautiful public market, a really, really nice, clean, sanitary, and inspiring market. And then that's when, after talking about it back and forth, he then said, you know what, let's make a private market that was nice and that was something to look forward to. So going back to the topic of architecture and change, again, we're not going to save the world through what we do, but we can make it better one way or another.
So it sounds to me like you have something in common with a young man. What's your name again?
I read that book in my final year
Joseph.
as well.
Joseph. So it sounds like both you and Joseph were changed by architecture as much as, or maybe even more so than you were able to change architecture through your craft, at least insofar as your formative experiences were concerned. AJ, you wanted to say something on that?
Yeah, going into connected to what Rick said, although this may be a provocative insight on, we do discuss we do discuss this topic academically in school. And the proposal is architecture relative to change making doesn't really have any power at all. Our architecture, traditionally up to the end of the modern era of modernism, has always been, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, you're also an academic, has always been a vassal to a more powerful institution, particularly government, empire, the church, or big business. The architecture has never moved on its own across the ages, from the Egyptian age up to the last Marcos regime. It has always been supported by a powerful patron in the form of the three institutions. It is only up to of late when the internet leveled everyone and gave access to the individual, did the architecture became empowered to actually tell itself, yeah, I could actually effect change for myself, and I could even hazard to dream for my nation and put architecture as one of the instruments of nation building. So hence, this topic of architecture of change, it is a new, it's an emerging item of discussion. But my point is, the patron will never go. I think large-scale infrastructure still needs always the support of that powerful patron. And it has always been the business of the architect, who's the participant in this architectural industry, to actually politically align himself to the patrons that be, or else be the patron himself. If this is a bibingka where you have fire on top and fire in the bottom so that the cake turns out to be good, if you do not align to the fire on top, you only have the fire in the bottom, which is this bottom to top approach. The product is half-baked. So that is a very depressing position.
What if the patron is a dictator whose ideologies you don't necessarily align with or deal with? What would you do as an architect?
We should ask, which is
Let's
very
ask one of
controversial.
them.
Controversial, I mean, it has been a touchy question for Manyosa and Locsin.
I think the answer to that, personally, is what is the purpose, even if it's bad money. But the purpose is for social housing. So the end user and who's going to benefit from it would not be the dirty patron, but the needy. So, but if it was something that you were commissioned to do that you don't believe in your heart, then how can you be a good designer if your heart is not in it? So as a good architect, you have to say no to it, because you can't do a good job with it.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, so we won a project a couple of years ago with DPWH. And when we won that project, we got emails coming in from other parts of our business. Obviously, they're aware of what's going on around the Philippines, and I think at the time the president was a little bit more extreme than he may be now. And we got emails coming in saying, why are we working for the Philippine government? You're supporting someone. And we'd been commissioned to design or to do feasibility studies of a number of big bridge projects, interconnection between communities which don't currently have that interconnection. And exactly the same thought process for ourselves. It's that project, or those projects, will, in the long run, deliver positive benefit to the overall country, to the communities they interact with. And we can bring our knowledge, our experience, our skill, to make sure those projects are set up appropriately. So we don't just go and dump a bridge on top of a community. We put that bridge in a location which fits. And one of my colleagues explained, look, we don't put the ramp down into the community, we move it round the other side of the community so that the whole community can stay in place. So we can use that skill set in the right way. But yeah, it's a fundamental question. Why are you doing a project? It has to be done properly and appropriately in the right conditions.
And I'm happy that you raised that point. I mean, ethics, morals, social standards, those are not things that we or any other professional can avoid. We have to make decisions. I remember when I was a young architect, I asked myself that question. I really wasn't thinking in the political context, because I was working and being educated and living in a say a fully democratic society. But I did have a tremendous concern, say, about the penal system, and I made a decision early on that I would not participate, say, in the design of prisons. So we only have a few minutes left. Let's go back to our young architects, and I'm curious now about the dilemma that AJ has presented to you. Are there projects that you can imagine that you would decline for reasons of religious belief, for reasons of ethical standards, or any other criteria that you can imagine preventing yourself? In other words, can you imagine yourself less of a neutral technocrat and more as a fully engaged citizen, with all of that implies, while wearing the hat of an architect?
Anyone from the audience?
Hello. Good evening. I am Steven from Batangas State University. I'm a second year.
Stephen?
Yes, I'm second year student of architecture from Batangas State University. I'm actually a fan of Sir Javier, but for this, I'm going to side with Ma'am Peach because I believe that in creation, like how an artist creates his art, he pours a portion of himself, and if the artist does not believe or does not willingly give himself to his craft, he cannot truly create a masterpiece. And as a young student, I am currently finding more insights on how this profession can impact change, and I believe that our personal beliefs and our own decisions will shape the world that we want to create. That's
Any others? You may as well volunteer before I volunteer you.
Can I add up to that, sir?
Yes, please.
I'm not sure if I'm right, but Oscar Niemeyer is an atheist, right? But he was able to design the Brasilia Cathedral. I think architecture is just like journalism. You may have your own personal biases in terms of politics and your opinions, but I think just like journalism, you as a journalist, you should not be biased with the news. You should write based on both sides. And I think that's a very nice thing about architecture because we should translate and we should reflect society and how we all work together unbiased. I think that's
Interesting. Is that a radical position? I think it contradicts what AJ is suggesting. So, and of course, I think that's a slightly more benign hypothetical. I mean, designing a church if you're an atheist, although I can imagine there is a certain level of hypocrisy there, but maybe it doesn't rise to the level of maybe being Albert Speer, who may not have fully agreed with the, Nazi ideology and yet, willingly took many commissions from the Nazi state. So where is that line? Is that a slippery slope, or are we legitimately allowed, I guess, to create a kind of moving standard that obliges us to make that kind of a decision on a case-by-case basis?
I'll just comment on that. A friend of mine, we always discuss about this. She asked me if Imelda Marcos would approach me now and commission my firm to do a project which I know genuinely will impact positive social change. Maybe she would know, maybe she would not. But the point is, she would give the commission. And it was a question that I could not answer because, for one, my family is supporting the other family. But nonetheless, it's like, it made me think, yeah, why not? Just like what our host has said. Up to what point would you deny? Would I deny myself of my political, my religious, and my social convictions because there is a higher order function of social or national change to be achieved, even if the patron is not of your alignment? It's an answer that I still could not give a... It's a question I could not give an answer to. And it may be an unfair question to ask the two great architects, Locsin and Manyosa, about what happened in the Marcos era, and maybe Renzo Piano and during the time of President Pompidou. So, I mean, there are various models, but that fact still remains, and that question is still in the air on that ethical behavior, on where we should put ourselves. I don't think it's only limited to architects, as Adrian has said.
Can I make a comment on
Yeah, of course.
the atheist designing a nice church? Being an atheist just says that you don't believe in religion. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person. But you can be a good architect with a good heart that is dedicated to your profession, do a good job, whether it's a church or a mosque or a stadium, and do an equally good project solution to it if your heart is in it. He is probably, when he designed it, he was really into architecture. He knew what architecture meant. So he got the solution.
Yeah, and if I could just give a quick view, to your point, one area that we find most challenging now is the environmental sustainability of projects. So, like for example, if someone brings us a coal-fired power plant now, we're careful how we phrase this because you can't ever say no. Someone asks me to go and help repair a power plant that's already in operation. Yeah, actually, my personal opinion is that actually it's worth doing, because why throw away a piece of infrastructure, a piece of equipment that's got another 20 years of useful life in it? That's actually sustainable. But if someone comes to me and says, can we start looking at a new coal-fired power plant? That's a very different question, because you can actually affect a very positive change there by saying there's probably better technology. So it depends what your where you go. I think the question of your client is a harder one than the type of project. Client choice is a very sensitive subject, and you've got to be very careful to handle that appropriately. Sometimes you can say yes, sometimes you can't say no, and you have to find the right project within that. There may be something else you can offer to do to help.
That's well put. Rika, did you want to follow
Yeah,
up?
I just wanted to add two things. So one, in response to what JC was saying earlier, it's actually more common than you think that people, we had this conversation last Friday with a bunch of architects. We were talking about places of worship and how they enact emotion and inspire emotion and experience. It's actually very common for then we realized when people started saying, okay, I did a stupa, I did a church, I did a mosque, that somebody of another religion would do that project, particularly because he would have no biases. Wong Munsum of Moha was talking about the church that he did, and he was like, yeah, it's kind of funny, it was a competition, and I was the only non-Christian in that competition, and they won. And he said, I suspect it's probably because of the fact that I wouldn't have biases toward any part of the mass and whatever. But going back to what you said earlier, if you got this commission from somebody whose principles and ideas you didn't necessarily believe in, would you take it? My office is kind of guilty of that. 2 years ago, and 2 years ago, and I knew what it was for. 2 years ago, just before the when was the last election? 2019. 2019, so 2018 election. We were approached by a government office asking us to help, well, it'd be so obvious, but to help vision Manila, to help see how we could create change in Manila and how we could just suggest anything. I knew this was too big a project to do on my own. So we reached out to another office, and then we started talking, like, will we do this? We will get so much criticism for doing this. But then again, we talked about it, and we looked at our principles and said, if we can do something to make Manila better, would you do it, regardless of who it was for? And the answer was yes. So we came up with the urban regeneration plan of Metro Manila, of the city of Manila. And although we did get criticism on some projects, there were 10 projects, in general, I think it was a good way. Although it didn't push through because that candidate didn't win. It was a good way to see how to assess and to look and to reflect what we could do to improve the city. And if those projects had happened, like if they had happened, then we would all benefit, whether or not you believed in that candidate's platform or not.
So I think we're nearing the end of the discussion, if I'm not mistaken. We just have a minute or two left, but I'm really so happy at the way the discussion turned into something very tangible and very helpful, and in a way that reminds us more mature practitioners, but especially presents in a very real, pragmatic, inescapable way the decisions that you young architects are going to have to make as you move forward into career. So architecture and design are not exercises in the formation of beauty. They are not exercises in the search for and development of technological excellence alone. They are also decisions that are predicated on values. And if you start to think about how your value sets that you have grown up with, or that you have evolved, or that you are questioning right now, will impact, and will frame the work that you do in the future, then I think this will have been an hour very well spent. So thank you very, very much.
I think,
Thank
sir,
you,
we could
panelists.
still entertain questions.
Yeah, sure. Do you have another question?
We could still entertain 2 more questions from the audience. Any question? Oh, we got one there.
Hi, good afternoon. Hi, Toby. Yeah, I'm not a student. I'm practicing. Hello. Right. This question is basically because I also teach part-time at our university in Pampanga. And this question, I want to affect change when I get back. And I just want to, I agree that as architects, we don't have all the answers, that we are not we cannot solve everything because we have our students proposing thesis proposals that talks about how do they solve healthcare, these big complex projects. And at the back of my mind, I know that these are not really the scale of issues that an architect can solve. So we try to frame I always try to tell them to frame their study or their focus on the scope of what an architect can do. And if you remember, Toby, back in 2017, we had this competition for the shelter for displaced humanities for the Rohingya people. And even when we finished our entry back then, I'm still not convinced that our proposal could really address the shelter problem for for these displaced population. So for our students, because for education, we're trying to get that balance between idealistic and pragmatic. To what extent can we accept proposals that are smaller in scale but are more impactful? Because I tell them that even if your proposal is just a waiting shed or a bus stop, but if it has a better solution to a more realistic problem, then I would accept that than a medical complex that has all these flair and forms, but doesn't really translate what we want to do. So how do we affect that to our students that without limiting their aspirations and dreams as young designers?
I think that's a great question, which I think in your context as an educator, and mine as well, and AJ's, it makes me think about what our role is fundamentally in helping a young designer or an architect transition into some role of leadership, both independently and also collectively. So how can we lead the march towards change? So the idea of framing the problem rather than accepting the manner by which it has been framed, I think that's probably the single most critical skill that we have to learn, say, outside of all of the academic topics. So I think it's fundamentally important, it's essential to the work that we do, that we find a way to help our client or help our society or help our community reimagine the question, so that the process of getting to the beginning of the creative process that will ultimately lead to a solution, that is the thing that we can, I think, most effectively contribute to. That's why in my school, for example, we never provide a program, we never provide a brief to the student. The students have to write their own brief, because they have to be able to kind of curate a solution, and that can only happen if they understand the problem and they are able to assimilate it and translate it into a particular direction that only they are capable of articulating. So I think you're absolutely right. I think the question of scale is significant, and of course in a thesis project you sometimes want to boost up the scale so that there are levels of complexity and simultaneity. So they're worried, at a high level about structure, they're worried at a high level of circulation, and so on and so forth. But the idea that they are singularly responsible for understanding the problem, for establishing the dialectic, especially towards the end of it, I think is exactly the right thing.
Can I add to that?
You
So, to answer your question, I studied in the University of Bath, which is a center of excellence for engineering in the UK. And then I studied in the Architectural Association, specifically because it was the complete contrast of the pedagogy in Bath, where in Bath you had to finish every semester you had to design a building that was realistic, that would be criticized by engineers, by mechanical engineers, on the viability and the feasibility of that building. Then I studied at the AA, where you didn't even have to submit a building. My final submission was literally a collage. It was art. And then I came back to the Philippines, and then I studied in NU, at the National University, where every semester I'm just sitting exams. I never sat an exam in the UK, never. And it was more about studio, and it was more about writing and literature and whatever have you. So I think there's no one right way of doing things, but I think education, your time in university should be a time for you to explore. Now I have a greater appreciation of what I studied in the AA, because then it opens you to opportunities in a sort of utopian sense, where you have the idea of possibility, and hope. But I guess I'm actually learning things in NU that I never learned that I never learned in the UK, and it's more about the technical things, like how to actually, like, about all these building utilities. I didn't have that in the AA. So as long as you know the basics, I think you shouldn't stifle students from dreaming, because you should always stay hungry. You should always stay foolish, because it is in these dreams and in these hopes that people then create change through architecture.
Did we have time for one other question?
I think that's it.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you so much, guys. I think that concludes our Shelter Dialogues, the last panel discussion for this year's Shelter Dialogues of Anthology, Architecture and Design Festival 2020. Any last words from our panelists and our moderator?
No other than to thank you very much for being an attentive audience, and my panelists for accepting the challenge of digging a little bit more deeply into this very critical and important topic, especially as it concerns the young architects in the audience. So thank you so much.
May I just say, as parting words to the students, when I have yet to meet a person that took up architecture because they just love architecture, that really they could love architecture because their dad or their uncle is an architect. But I have yet to meet somebody that took up architecture because it's their dream ever since they were young. It's always an accident. But in the course of taking architecture, 5 years, I see it as a rite of passage. Those that pursue architecture and become architects later on, they in fact change inside. I think what you need to ask yourself and what you need to develop on your way to graduation, on your way to becoming an architect, is what it means to be an architect. We are the only profession that can affect change in big ways. We can affect not only the users, we can affect their future. If we can affect their future, we can affect the community and the environment. An accountant cannot do that, diba? But you'll know what I mean. You'll know the answer to what I'm saying if you look inside you and ask yourself, do I really want to be an architect? After you answer the question, what it takes to be an architect. Thank you.